The dust on the road had a way of clinging to a man's boots long after he stopped walking, and Diego Serrano had been walking for 3 days when he finally saw the windmill turning above the Vidal ranch. His daughter, Lucia, was pressed against his chest in a sling made from an old flour sack, her small fists working at nothing, her cries thin and hoarse from hunger. He had given her the last of the goat's milk 2 towns back, and since then there had been only water and the promises he kept whispering to her that things would be better soon. Promises he was no longer sure he believed. The gate stood open, its hinges rusted the color of dried blood, and beyond it stretched pasture land so green it looked like a mistake in a country this dry. A woman was crouched by the water trough, her sleeves rolled to the elbow, her dark hair pulled back with a strip of leather. She rose when she heard his footsteps, and there was nothing soft in the way she looked at him, only the flat, appraising stare of someone who had learned the hard way that strangers rarely arrived with anything good.
"This is private land," she said. "You're a long way from town."
"I know it," Diego answered, and he felt Lucia stir against him, her cry rising sharp and thin into the afternoon air. "I'm not looking for trouble, Señora. I'm looking for milk for my daughter, and I'll work for it. Any work you have." The baby's cry seemed to reach the woman before his words did. Something in her face shifted, quick as a cloud crossing the sun, there and gone. She looked at the sling, at the small, red face inside it, and for a moment her hand went to her own stomach in a gesture Diego didn't understand yet, though later he would learn it was the same place she pressed whenever grief caught her by surprise. "How old is she?" the woman asked. 4 months. Her mother died bringing her into the world. There was no money for a doctor in time, and I've been carrying her ever since, looking for enough work to keep us both fed." He said it plainly, without asking for pity, because pity was not what he had come for. The woman studied him a long moment, the way a rancher studies weather before deciding whether to bring the cattle in. Then she turned and walked toward the barn, and over her shoulder she said the words that would change the shape of both their lives. "You need milk for your baby, and I need a man to help run this ranch," she said. "My name is Elena Vidal. I lost my husband 7 months ago, and I've been trying to do the work of 2 people ever since. I have milking cows, I have fences that need mending before the rains come, and I have more land than I can watch by myself. You work for me, and your daughter gets fresh milk every morning, a roof over her head, and food on the table. That's the offer. Take it, or keep walking." Diego stood very still. It was not charity, and that was exactly what let him say yes. A man could not carry his pride down a dusty road forever, but he could carry a fair trade. "I'll take it," he said, "and I'll earn every bit of it." Elena nodded once, as if the matter were already closed, and led him toward a small adobe building behind the main house, its roof patched with tin, its single window facing east toward the hills. It was not much, she told him, but it was dry, and it was his for as long as the arrangement lasted. That evening, as Lucia finally drank her fill of warm milk and slept in his arms for the first time in days without crying, Diego sat on the step of the little house and watched the sun go down over land that was not his, working for a woman who had not smiled once, and felt something in his chest loosen just slightly, the way a knot loosens when the rope is finally set down. Inside the main house, Elena stood at the window and watched the lamplight flicker in the small building across the yard. She had not meant to say yes so quickly. She had told herself for months that she needed no one, that she could mend fences and milk cows and keep the books all by herself, the way she had these past 7 months since they carried Raphael's body in from the north pasture. But watching that baby cry against a stranger's chest, she had felt something crack that she had spent all this time trying to keep sealed shut. She thought of Raphael then, the way she always did at the end of a long day, remembering how he used to whistle while he worked the fence line, how he had gone out alone that morning because she had insisted the calves needed tending first, how the horse had come back without him. She had told herself so many times since that if there had been another pair of hands that day, if she had not sent him out there alone, he might still be walking this land beside her. It was a wound that never quite closed, and she carried it the way a fence post carries a scar where the wire has bitten in too many times. She did not know yet that the man sleeping in the small house across the yard carried a wound of his own, cut from the same knife of guilt. The belief that if he had only found work sooner, if he had only had enough money, his wife might still be alive too. Two people standing at opposite ends of the same grief, though neither of them could see that yet. The next morning came up gray and cool, the kind of morning that promised rain before the season was truly ready to give it. Diego was up before the sun, standing awkwardly by the barn door, uncertain where to begin. Elena found him there and handed him a bucket without a word, nodding toward the milking stalls, and for the first hour they worked in silence, broken only by the soft thud of milk against tin and the occasional low complaint of a cow shifting her weight.
You've done this before,
Elena said finally, watching his hands work steady and sure against the udder. My father kept goats, Diego said, not cows, but the hands remembered the same rhythm. She almost smiled at that, though she caught herself before it reached her mouth and turned back to her own work. It was the first sign, small as it was, that something between them might grow into more than a bargain struck at a gate. By mid-morning, a rider appeared on the eastern ridge, moving unhurried down the slope on a black horse that had clearly never known hunger a day in its life. Elena's shoulders tightened the moment she saw him, and Diego noticed it, though he said nothing, only kept working while he watched from the corner of his eye.
Hector Salinas,
Elena said under her breath, more to herself than to Diego. Our neighbor to the east. He's been very neighborly lately, considering his family and mine haven't spoken kindly in 30 years. Hector dismounted at the fence line with the easy confidence of a man who had never once doubted his welcome anywhere, and he tipped his hat toward Elena with a smile that did not quite reach his eyes. Elena, he said, I heard you'd taken on help. Didn't realize you were hiring strangers off the road. I'm hiring whoever can do the work, Hector. Same as always. Her voice was even, but there was steel beneath it, the kind of steel that comes from years of practice keeping men like Hector at a careful distance. Hector's eyes moved to Diego, taking his measure the way a buyer takes the measure of livestock, then back to Elena. I only came to ask again about the boundary survey your father commissioned years back. My lawyer tells me the old markers along the creek may have shifted since the flood in '98. Worth checking before something gets contested that neither of us wants contested. There's nothing to check, Hector. The creek's boundary has been the same since my grandfather's time, and you know it. Elena's jaw was tight, and Diego saw for the first time the flicker of something underneath her steadiness, something closer to fear than anger. I only want to be neighborly, Hector said, though his smile suggested otherwise, and he swung back up onto his horse. Give my regards to your brother next time he visits, Elena. Tell him I hope he talks some sense into you before the season's out. With that, he rode off the way he had come, leaving behind him a silence that felt heavier than before he'd arrived. Diego said nothing until the rider was well out of sight, and then he asked the question carefully. That man wants something from you.
He wants the creek,
Elena said, staring after the dust cloud on the ridge. His family lost a land dispute to mine 2 generations back, and Hector's father never let him forget it. Now he thinks marrying me would settle the old score more neatly than any court ever could. She said it flatly, as if the idea disgusted her too much to dress it in anger. I won't let him have either the water or me, Mr. Serrano. Not while there's breath in me. Diego looked at her then. This woman, with her sleeves rolled up and her jaw set like stone, and understood for the first time the true size of the burden she was carrying alone. Then it's a good thing you've got an extra pair of hands now, he said quietly. Something in Elena's face shifted again, quick and unguarded, before she caught it and turned back toward the barn. Don't go thinking you're anything more than hired help, Serrano, she said. but there was no real bite in it, and they both knew it. That night, as Diego rocked Lucia to sleep by lamplight, he found himself thinking not of the milk or the wages, but of the flash of vulnerability he'd seen cross Elena's face at the mention of her husband's memory, and of the quiet ache still living in his own chest where Marisol used to be. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwoods along the creek, carrying with it the smell of rain not yet arrived, and somewhere far off, a coyote called once and fell silent.
As if even the desert itself were waiting to see what these two broken people might make of each other. The rain that had been promising itself for a week finally broke on the fourth morning of Diego's second week at the ranch, coming down in fat, deliberate drops that darkened the dust to the color of coffee grounds before it thickened into a steady curtain across the yard. Elena stood in the doorway of the barn, watching it fall, and Diego joined her there, both of them silent for a moment before she spoke. "The north fence line needs mending before this rain softens the ground any further," she said. "There's a stretch near the old well that Raphael never got to finish."
Diego heard the way her voice caught, ever so slightly, on her husband's name, the way a boot catches on a loose board, and he understood without being told that this was not an ordinary chore she was assigning him. "I'll see to it," he said simply, and something in his plainness seemed to steady her. They worked the fence line together that afternoon, once the rain eased into a fine mist, Elena holding the wire taut while Diego drove the staples home. And for the first hour, neither of them spoke of anything but the work itself. The angle of the post, the give of the wire, the particular stubbornness of a knot that refused to hold. It was the kind of silence that asked nothing of either of them, and Diego found he did not mind it at all.
"This is where it happened," Elena said finally, not looking at him, her eyes fixed on a weathered post a few yards ahead. "Raphael was out here alone, fixing this very stretch, and his horse spooked at something, a snake maybe, we never knew for certain. He went down hard, and by the time I found him it was already too late."
Her voice was steady, the way water is steady right before it goes over a fall, all that force held back by nothing more than habit. Diego set down his hammer. "You don't have to tell me this. I want you to understand why I sent you out here today instead of somewhere else," Elena said, finally turning to look at him. "I could have avoided this stretch of fence forever. I've been avoiding it for 7 months. But you're here now, and there's someone to hold the other end of the wire. And I think that matters more than my fear of this place." Her eyes were wet, though she did not let the tears fall, and Diego recognized in that restraint something of his own grief, the way he still sometimes reached for Marisol's hand in his sleep before remembering. "My wife died because I didn't have enough money to get her to a doctor in time," Diego said, the words coming out rougher than he intended. "I've carried that the same way you're carrying this fence, Señora. I understand better than you might think." For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the mist settling cool against their faces, the cattle lowing somewhere behind them in the gray afternoon light. Then Elena picked up the wire again, and Diego picked up his hammer, and they finished the stretch of fence together. And something between them had shifted, quiet and unspoken, like the first crack of light under a door that had been shut a long time. That evening, over a simple supper of beans and tortillas at the kitchen table, Lucia, asleep in a basket by the stove, Elena found herself telling Diego about her father, about the ranch's early years, about the drought of her childhood that had nearly broken her grandfather before the rains finally came. Diego listened the way a man listens when he has been alone with his grief too long, hungry for the ordinary sound of another person's voice. And he told her in turn about Marisol, about her laugh, about the small yellow house they had rented in Chihuahua before everything fell apart. It was Lucia who broke the spell, waking with a soft, hoarse cough that made both adults go still. Elena rose first, crossing to the basket before Diego could, and lifted the baby with the easy confidence of someone who had done this before, though Diego had never asked, and did not ask now, whether she and Raphael had once hoped for children of their own.
"She's warm," Elena said, pressing the back of her hand to Lucia's forehead.
But not fevered. Just a cold, likely from the change in weather. Keep her close tonight and warm.
Diego took his daughter back into his arms, grateful and a little unsettled by how naturally Elena had moved to help, and thanked her quietly. And if either of them noticed how long his hand lingered near hers as you took the baby, neither said so. The following days fell into a rhythm neither of them had expected to find so easily. Diego rose before dawn to help with the milking, and Elena found herself teaching him the finer points of the ranch's bookkeeping in the evenings, since a second pair of eyes on the ledgers, she admitted grudgingly, was not the worst idea she'd ever had. Lucia's cough lingered but did not worsen, and in the space of 2 weeks she had grown so accustomed to Elena's voice that she quieted at the sound of it even faster than at her father's. It was on a Sunday, the one day the ranch allowed itself something like rest, that Hector Salinas returned, this time bringing with him a folded paper he was clearly eager to produce. He found Elena in the yard, hanging washed linens on a line strung between 2 posts, and Diego, close by, mending a bridle on the porch step, and Hector's eyes flicked between them with an expression that was not quite suspicion yet, but was gathering toward it. "I brought something for you to look at," Hector said, unfolding the paper with the practiced flourish of a man who enjoyed being the one holding information others did not yet have. "A survey map from my grandfather's time. According to this, the creek boundary sat nearly 40 yards east of where your fence stands now." Elena did not reach for the paper. "Maps drawn by men with something to gain from the drawing aren't maps I trust, Hector. My grandfather's deed is recorded at the county office, plain and clear, and it says the creek is mine." "Deeds can be contested," Hector said, his smile thinning at the edges, "especially old ones, filed before the county had proper surveying equipment. I'd hate to see you spend money on lawyers you clearly can't spare, Elena, when a simpler arrangement might serve us both." "And what arrangement would that be?" Elena asked, though her tone made clear she already knew the answer and despised it. Hector's gaze slid deliberately toward Diego before returning to her. "One that doesn't involve you hiring strange men off the road to prop up a ranch that's clearly become too much for one woman to manage alone." Diego set down the bridle and rose slowly to his feet, saying nothing, letting his presence alone answer the insult. And Hector, to his credit, or perhaps his cowardice, chose not to press the point further in the moment. "Think about what I've said, Elena," Hector said instead, folding the paper away again. "The season's turning, and disputes like this have a way of getting expensive for the smaller ranch, no matter how right the smaller ranch might be." He tipped his hat and rode off, and this time, Elena did not watch him go, choosing instead to turn back to her washing with hands that trembled, just slightly, with anger. "He's bluffing," Diego said once the hoofbeats had faded. "A survey that old wouldn't hold up against a recorded deed, not without real proof of an error." "I know that," Elena said, "but knowing it and having the money to prove it in a courtroom are 2 very different things, Diego." It was the first time she had used his given name, and both of them noticed it, though neither remarked upon it. That night, after Lucia was finally settled and the house had gone quiet, Diego found Elena still awake at the kitchen table, the old deed spread before her under lamplight, her finger tracing the boundary line again and again, as if repetition alone might make her feel safer. "You should sleep," Diego said gently, standing in the doorway. "I keep thinking of Rafael," Elena admitted, not looking up. "He always said Hector's threats were just noise, that the man didn't have the stomach to follow through on anything. I used to believe him. Now I'm not so sure I can afford to." Diego crossed the room and sat across from her, and for a moment he considered reaching for her hand before deciding against it, uncertain whether such comfort would be welcome yet. "You're not alone in it anymore," he said instead. "Whatever Hector tries, you won't be facing it by yourself this time." Elena looked up at him then, something unguarded in her eyes that she quickly smoothed away, though not quickly enough to hide it entirely. "Careful, Serrano," she said, a ghost of dry humor returning to her voice.
A woman could get used to hearing something like that.
Would that be so terrible? Diego asked quietly.
And neither of them answered, though the silence that followed was warmer than any words might have been, filled with the soft creak of the house settling and the distant, patient rhythm of rain returning to the roof.
By the time the season turned fully toward the rains, Diego had been at the Vidal Ranch nearly 2 months, and the little adobe house across the yard had begun to feel less like a stranger's shelter and more like his own. Lucia had grown plump and easy in her laughter, her cough long since passed, and it was not uncommon now for Elena to carry her about the kitchen while she cooked, murmuring old lullabies in Spanish that Diego recognized from his own childhood. Though he never told her so directly, only listened from the doorway with something aching and grateful in his chest. It was on such an evening, the sky gone the deep purple of a fresh bruise over the western hills, that Elena and Diego found themselves alone on the porch after Lucia had finally fallen asleep. A rare quiet stretched comfortably between them. The crickets had started their evening chorus in the tall grass beyond the fence, and somewhere a nightjar called twice and fell silent. And Elena, for reasons she could not entirely explain even to herself, began to speak of Raphael in a way she had not allowed herself to before.
"He used to sit right here," she said, gesturing to the step beside her. "Every evening, whistling some tune his father taught him. And I used to think I would go mad if I ever had to sit through one more evening of that same 3 notes, over and over." She laughed softly, though there was a tremble beneath it. "Now I'd give anything to hear it just once more."
"Grief plays tricks like that," Diego said. "I used to complain that Marisol left her hairpins scattered across every surface of our little house. Now I keep a few of them in my pocket, just to have something of hers close."
He drew one out as he spoke, a small tarnished thing, and held it in his palm like a man holding a coal that had long since gone cold, but still carried the memory of heat. Elena reached out, almost without meaning to, and touched the hairpin gently with one finger. "She sounds like she filled a room," Elena said.
"She did," Diego answered. "The way you fill this ranch, I think. Though I don't know if you see it that way yourself."
Elena's breath caught, just slightly, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the space between them thick with something neither was yet ready to name. It was Elena who broke the silence first, drawing back just enough to put a careful distance between them again. "I loved my husband very much," she said, as if reminding herself as much as him. "I don't know how to want anything else without feeling like I'm betraying what we had."
"I understand that better than most,"
Diego said gently.
"I'm not asking you to forget her, or him, or any of it. I'm only asking you to let the rest of us in too, little by little, whenever you're ready for it."
The words came out softer than he intended, and he watched them land on her like the first cool drops of rain on parched ground, uncertain whether they would be welcomed or would simply run off unabsorbed. Elena did not answer him directly that night, only rose and murmured something about checking on Lucia, though the baby was sound asleep and needed no checking at all. And Diego let her go without pressing further, understanding that some doors open only at their own pace. The days that followed carried a new tension between them. Not unpleasant exactly, but charged, the way the air feels charged before a storm finally breaks. Elena found herself watching Diego's hands as he worked the fence lines, noticing the careful, deliberate way he handled every task, whether it was mending a saddle or rocking his daughter to sleep. And she began to understand that gentleness and strength were not opposites in this man, the two sides of the very same coin. It was during this stretch of uneasy tenderness that Hector Salinas made his move in earnest. He arrived not on horseback this time, but in a truck driven by a young clerk from the county office, and the paper he carried this time was no old family survey, but an official notice of dispute, freshly filed, demanding a formal review of the boundary line along the creek before the next grazing season began.
"I did warn you, Elena," Hector said, standing in the yard with the notice held out toward her like a blade offered for inspection.
I'd hate for this to drag through the courts for months, draining whatever savings you've managed to keep. There's still a simpler way to settle this, if you're willing to consider it.
I've told you my answer already,
Elena said, though her hands trembled slightly as she took the notice from him and scanned its contents.
This is harassment, Hector, plain and simple, and any judge with sense will see it for what it is.
Perhaps, Hector said, though judges have a way of favoring whoever arrives with the tidier paperwork, and I've had my lawyers preparing for months. Have you had time to prepare anything at all, between milking cows and playing house with your hired man?
His eyes flicked deliberately toward Diego, who stood near the barn with his jaw tight but his hands still, refusing to give Hector the satisfaction of a reaction.
Get off my land, Hector,
Elena said, her voice low and dangerous now, all pretense of civility gone.
You'll get your answer in court, same as everyone else who's tried to take what isn't theirs.
Hector smiled, unbothered, and climbed back into the waiting truck.
The review is set for 3 weeks from now, Elena. I suggest you find your grandfather's original deed before then, assuming it still exists anywhere outside of your imagination.
The truck pulled away in a cloud of dust, and Elena stood in the yard clutching the notice, her composure cracking at last, now that there was no one left to perform it for, save Diego, who crossed the yard quickly and steadied her by the shoulders.
We'll find the deed, Diego said firmly. You said yourself it's recorded at the county office.
Recorded, yes. But recorded documents can be lost, misfiled, damaged in a fire, Elena said, her voice tight with a fear she rarely allowed herself to show. The county courthouse burned in the flood of '98, the same flood Hector claims moved his boundary markers. If our copy of the original deed went with it, all I have left is my grandfather's word passed down through my father, and that means nothing in a courtroom. Her hands were shaking now in earnest, and Diego did not let go of her shoulders, holding steady the way he had learned to hold steady for Lucia during her worst nights of colic, offering presence where he had no solution to offer.
Then we look everywhere on this ranch that a deed might have been kept safe, Diego said. Your father's old trunk, the church records, if your family ever filed a copy there, anywhere at all. We have 3 weeks, Elena. That's enough time if we don't waste a single day of it.
Something in his certainty steadied her, the way a fence post steadies a length of wire that would otherwise sag under its own weight. And Elena nodded, wiping her eyes quickly before the tears could fall in earnest.
Thank you, she said quietly. I don't know what I would have done these past weeks without you here. You'd have managed, Diego said. You always have. But I'm glad you don't have to. Not this time.
He meant it as simple comfort, but something in the way he said it, low and warm, made Elena look up at him with an expression that was equal parts gratitude and something else entirely, something that neither of them was quite brave enough yet to call by its true name. That night, long after Lucia had been fed and settled, Elena sat at the kitchen table with her father's old ledgers spread before her, searching for any mention of where the original deed might have been filed a second time, and Diego sat across from her, patient and steady, helping her comb through decades of faded handwriting by lamplight. It was slow, careful work, and more than once their hands brushed, reaching for the same page, and more than once neither of them pulled away as quickly as propriety might have demanded. Near midnight, exhausted and no closer to an answer, Elena finally set down the ledger she'd been studying and rubbed her eyes.
We'll find it,
Diego said again, though this time it was less certainty than simple faith, offered because she needed it more than facts just then.
I hope you're right,
Elena murmured, and in the lamplight her face looked softer than Diego had ever seen it, the hard edges worn thin by fear and exhaustion, and something gentler underneath both.
3 weeks isn't very long, Diego.
Long enough, he said, if we face it together. And though the words were plain and small, they settled over the kitchen table like the first true warmth of morning after a cold, uncertain night. And outside, Far off, across the darkened pastureland, the first low rumble of a distant storm rolled quietly across the hills, as if the land itself were gathering its strength for whatever was still to come. The storm that had been rumbling at the edges of the hills for 3 days finally arrived in full on the night before the county's review was set to begin. And it arrived without mercy. Wind tearing at the cottonwoods along the creek and rain coming down in sheets so thick the barn was nearly invisible from the kitchen window. Elena had spent the better part of the week searching every trunk, every church ledger, every drawer in the house for her grandfather's original deed, and had found nothing but faded receipts and old letters that spoke of the land, without ever proving her claim to it in the way a courtroom would demand. Diego was out in the storm, checking the cattle when Lucia's cry changed. No longer the ordinary fuss of a hungry or tired child, but something sharper, more urgent. And Elena, who had been rocking the baby while Diego worked, felt the small body in her arms burning with a fever that had come on fast and fierce. She carried Lucia to the kitchen table, stripping the blanket away, pressing a cool cloth to the tiny forehead with hands that shook despite years of practice, keeping calm in a crisis.
Diego!
Elena called out into the storm, her voice nearly lost beneath the wind, but he must have heard something in the pitch of it, some note of true alarm, because he came running from the barn, soaked through and breathing hard. And the moment he saw his daughter's flushed face and glassy eyes, all the color drained from his own. "How long has she been like this?" he asked, already at the table, his hands hovering uncertain over her small body.
"Only a few minutes, but it's climbing fast," Elena said. "We need to get her into town, to the doctor, but Diego, listen to me. The creek will be running high with this rain, and the low bridge floods every storm season. We may not be able to cross."
Diego's jaw tightened, and for a moment the old guilt rose in him like bile, the memory of Marisol slipping away because help had come too slowly, and he could not, would not, let that happen again. "We have to try," he said. "I'll saddle the horses."
"The horses will never make it through water that high,"
Elena said, gripping his arm to stop him before he could bolt back out into the storm. "There's another way, an old cattle trail along the ridge that stays above the flood line, but it's rough and slow and dangerous in weather like this." "Then we take the ridge trail," Diego said. "Together. I'm not leaving either of you alone tonight, not with everything the way it is." They wrapped Lucia as warmly as they could and set out into the storm on foot, since no horse could be trusted on the narrow ridge trail in such wind. Elena carrying a lantern that guttered and nearly died a dozen times before they'd gone even a quarter mile. Diego carrying his daughter pressed tight against his chest beneath his own soaked coat, murmuring to her constantly, promises and prayers tangled together in a low, desperate stream. The trail was every bit as treacherous as Elena had warned, slick with mud, the wind threatening more than once to knock them both off their feet, and twice Elena stumbled hard enough that only Diego's free hand catching her elbow kept her from going down the steep slope toward the swollen creek below. Lightning lit the hills in sudden white flashes, and in one such flash, Elena saw Diego's face, stripped bare of every careful composure he usually wore, nothing left in it but raw fear for his daughter's life. And something in that unguarded moment moved her more deeply than any tender word he had spoken on the porch weeks before.
"She's fighting,"
Elena shouted over the wind, pressing her hand briefly to Lucia's back as they struggled forward.
"I can feel it, Diego. She's a fighter, just like her father."
They reached the far side of the ridge nearly an hour later, exhausted and soaked to the bone, and found the road to town just passable enough for old Dr. Fuentes' truck to meet them halfway. Having been alerted by a ranch hand, Elena had sent ahead on the fastest horse the moment the fever first showed. The doctor's examination in the back of his truck, parked under the meager shelter of a rock outcropping, felt to Diego like the longest 10 minutes of his life since the night Marisol died, and he gripped Elena's hand without either of them quite noticing when it had happened, holding on the way a drowning man holds a rope. "It's a bad fever, brought on by the change in weather and likely a touch of the lung," Dr. Fuentes said finally. "But her heart is strong,
and her lungs are clear enough that I don't fear pneumonia setting in tonight. Keep her warm, keep her fed, and bring her to see me again in 3 days' time. She'll pull through this, Diego. Children this age are tougher than we give them credit for."
The relief that broke over Diego then was so total it nearly buckled his knees, and it was Elena who caught him this time, her arm around his waist, steadying him the way his hand had steadied her on the trail. And for a long moment, neither of them moved, standing together in the rain with Lucia finally sleeping quiet and safe between them, the storm easing at last into a soft, steady drizzle.
"Thank you,"
Diego said, his voice breaking on the words.
"I don't know what I would have done tonight without you, Elena, truly."
We did it together,
Elena said softly, and there was something in her voice now that had not been there before. Some wall finally come down after months of careful guarding.
"The way we've done everything since you walked through that gate."
Diego turned to face her fully then, rain still falling lightly around them.
Lucia, a warm, sleeping weight between them, and he reached up to brush a wet strand of hair from Elena's face with a gentleness that made her breath catch. "I think I've fallen in love with you, Elena Vidal," he said quietly, the words coming out before he could weigh them, before caution or fear or old grief could stop them. "I didn't come here looking for it. I only came looking for milk for my daughter.
But somewhere along the way, you gave me so much more than that."
Well,
Elena's eyes filled with tears that were no longer only from exhaustion or fear,
and for a moment she said nothing at all, only pressed her forehead gently against his, the three of them standing together in the rain like something newly rooted, fragile but real.
"I think I love you too,"
she whispered finally.
"And it terrifies me more than anything Hector could ever put in front of a judge."
"We'll face that tomorrow," Diego said. "Tonight, let's just be grateful she's safe, and that we found each other on the way to keeping her that way."
They walked back together in the gentling rain, Dr. Fuentes offering to drive them the long way around by the main road now that the worst of the storm had passed. And by the time they reached the ranch house again, exhausted and soaked and hollowed out with spent fear, the sky to the east had begun to show the faintest gray promise of dawn. Elena settled Lucia into a warm bed near the kitchen stove, and Diego stood in the doorway watching her, feeling the full weight of everything they had just survived together,
and everything still unresolved that waited for them once the sun came fully up. Because for all that had shifted between them that night, the review of the boundary dispute was still only hours away. Hector Salinas's threat still hanging over the ranch like a storm cloud that had only paused rather than passed. And neither of them had found the one piece of paper that might settle the matter cleanly. The deed still missing, the courtroom still waiting. And love, however newly spoken,
would have to prove itself against more than just a night of shared fear before either of them could call it truly safe.
"What happens now?"
Elena asked quietly, watching the gray light spread slowly across the yard.
"If we can't find the deed in time."
Diego did not have an answer for her, not yet, only reached for her hand again in the fading dark and held it, the way a man holds on to the one solid thing left standing after a storm has taken everything else it could reach.
In the hour before the household finally allowed itself to sleep, Elena sat by the stove watching Lucia's chest rise and fall in steady, even breaths, and found herself thinking of the last time she had kept such a vigil. The long night after Raphael's accident, when she had sat alone at this very table, waiting for a doctor who arrived only in time to confirm what she already knew in her bones. The memory did not bring the same crushing grief it once had, though it still ached, softened now by the presence of the man dozing upright in the chair across from her, his hand still loosely wrapped around hers even in sleep. She studied his face in the low firelight, the exhaustion carved into the lines around his eyes, the stubborn set of his jaw, even in rest, and thought of how strange it was that a stranger who had walked through her gate 2 months ago now felt more essential to her than the ranch itself, more essential even
than the old fears she had guarded so carefully since Raphael's death. She thought, too, of Hector's threat, the review, only hours away now,
and felt a new kind of resolve settle into her chest, steadier than fear. The resolve of a woman who finally understood she had something worth fighting for beyond mere land. When Diego woke an hour later to the first true light of morning, he found Elena already dressed and moving through the kitchen with brisk purpose. Lucia's fever broken overnight, just as Dr. Fuentes had promised, her small cheeks pink with healthy color rather than the alarming flush of the night before.
"She's better,"
Elena said before he could even ask, relief plain in her voice.
"Her fever broke sometime before dawn. I checked on her twice while you slept."
Diego crossed the kitchen and gathered his daughter into his arms, feeling the steady, ordinary warmth of her small body against his chest, and allowed himself, for the first time since Marisol's death, to believe fully that the people he loved might actually be allowed to stay safe.
"Thank you," he said again, though the words felt too small for everything Elena had done that night. Everything she continued to do simply by standing beside him.
"We still have the review to face,"
Elena reminded him gently, though her voice had none of the brittle fear it had carried the day before.
"Hector will be there within a few hours, and we still don't have the deed."
"Then we go and tell the truth, as plainly as we know it," Diego said. "Your family has worked that creek boundary for 2 generations without contest, until Hector decided it suited him to remember otherwise. A judge with any sense will see the difference between an old family's honest claim and a neighbor's convenient memory."
Elena managed a small, tired smile at that, the first real smile Diego had seen from her since the storm broke. "You almost sound like a man who's argued a case or two in his time, Diego Serrano."
"Only ever argued for fair wages and honest work," Diego said.
"But I imagine the principle isn't so different." He reached for her hand again, steadier now in the morning light than it had been in the desperate dark of the night before, and together they prepared to face whatever the day still had waiting for them. The fear of losing the land tangled now inseparably with the fiercer, newer fear of losing each other, though neither of them said that second fear aloud. Not yet.
Not while so much still hung in uncertain balance. The county review was held in the small municipal building at the edge of town, a whitewashed room with ceiling fans that turned lazily against the summer heat, and by the time Elena and Diego arrived, still hollow-eyed from the night before but resolute, Hector Salinas was already seated at the front with his lawyer, looking every bit as confident as he had at the ranch gate weeks earlier. Judge Alvarez, an older man with a reputation for patience and little tolerance for theatrics, called the matter to order and asked first for the documentary evidence supporting the disputed boundary. Hector's lawyer produced the old survey map with practiced ease, laying out the argument that the flood of '98 had shifted the creek's course sufficiently to render the original boundary markers unreliable, and that a new survey was needed before any grazing rights could be assumed by either party.
"And what does the Vidal family offer in response?"
Judge Alvarez asked, turning his attention to Elena, who rose from her seat with her chin steady despite the tremor she still felt beneath her ribs.
"Your Honor, my family's deed has stood unchallenged for 2 generations, Elena said. "I do not currently have the original recorded copy in hand, as the courthouse fire of '98 destroyed portions of the county archive. But I have brought something I believe speaks just as clearly to the truth of this matter."
She gestured, and Diego stepped forward carrying a small, battered wooden box, setting it carefully on the table before the judge.
Inside were letters, dozens of them, correspondence between Elena's grandfather and Hector's own grandfather, discussing the boundary explicitly, in Hector's grandfather's own handwriting, acknowledging the creek as Vidal land in exchange for continued access to a smaller grazing easement further north. Elena had found the letters not in any trunk or ledger, but tucked inside the lining of her grandmother's old sewing box, discovered only the previous evening while searching desperately through every corner of the house during a brief lull in the storm.
"These letters predate the flood by decades,"
Elena said,
"and they carry Hector's own grandfather's signature, acknowledging in his own hand the very boundary his grandson now claims never existed." I would ask the court to weigh a family's word against itself, written plainly and honestly, before there was ever a reason to lie about it.
Hector's composure cracked visibly as the judge examined the letters, his lawyer leaning close to murmur something urgent that Hector waved away with obvious agitation. "This proves nothing," Hector said, rising despite his lawyer's hand on his sleeve. "Letters can be forged, dates altered. This is exactly the kind of desperate maneuver I'd expect from a woman about to lose everything she has."
The handwriting can be verified against other documents your own family has filed with this county over the years, Mr. Salinas, Judge Alvarez said evenly. And I would advise you to sit down before you say something you'll regret in front of a room full of witnesses. The room, which had filled with a scattering of townsfolk curious about the dispute, murmured at that. And Diego saw something in Hector's face crumple, not with guilt exactly, but with the particular defeat of a man who had staked his pride on a lie and watched it fail publicly. "I only wanted what my family should have had," Hector said finally, quieter now, some of the fight gone out of him. "My grandfather never forgave losing that creek. My father never forgave it either. I suppose I thought if I could take it back, I'd finally be free of carrying their shame." "Their shame was never yours to carry, Hector," Elena said, and there was no triumph in her voice, only something closer to weary compassion. "And it was never mine to give back to you. Not through land, and not through anything else you thought you might take instead." Judge Alvarez ruled within the hour. The boundary confirmed exactly where it had always stood. The dispute dismissed, with a formal warning against further contest without substantially new evidence, and Hector left the building without another word, his lawyer trailing behind him with an expression of professional embarrassment. Elena and Diego stood together on the steps outside afterward, the summer sun warm on their shoulders, the ordeal finally, truly over. But the relief did not erase every difficulty waiting for them still. Word had traveled fast through the small town, and that evening, Elena's older brother, Mateo, arrived unannounced from his own ranch 2 counties over, having heard secondhand of both the boundary dispute and, more troubling to him, the rumors already circulating about the hired man living so comfortably in his sister's house. "You've known him 2 months, Elena," Mateo said, standing in the kitchen with his hat still on, a habit that had always signaled his displeasure since childhood. 2 months, and already the whole county is whispering about the widow and her drifter. I'm not saying he's not a good worker, but you're not thinking clearly, not after everything with Rafael. And I worry you're mistaking gratitude for something it isn't.
"I'm not mistaking anything, Mateo," Elena said, though her voice carried less certainty than she wanted it to. "I know my own heart well enough, even after everything."
"Do you?" Mateo pressed. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like a woman still grieving her husband, leaning on the first steady hand that offered itself. And I'd be a poor brother if I didn't at least ask you to slow down and be sure." The conversation left Elena unsettled in a way the courtroom victory had not. And that evening she found herself avoiding Diego's eyes over supper, picking at her food, until finally he set down his fork and asked her plainly what troubled her.
"My brother thinks I'm confusing gratitude for love,"
Elena admitted.
"He thinks I'm not thinking clearly, that grief has made me vulnerable to leaning on you too quickly."
Diego was quiet for a long moment, considering his words carefully. "Your brother isn't entirely wrong to be cautious, Elena. Grief does strange things to a person's judgment. I know that better than most. But I also know the difference between leaning on someone out of desperation and choosing them with clear eyes. And I've watched you these past weeks. And I don't think what's grown between us is confusion at all." He reached across the table and took her hand. "But if you need time to be certain, truly certain, I'll wait. I'm not going anywhere, Elena. Not unless you ask me to."
"I don't want you to wait," Elena said quietly. "I want to be certain, right now, tonight, without needing more time to prove it to my brother or to anyone else.
But there's still the matter of the barn roof torn open in the storm, and the vet bill for the 2 calves that took sick during the flooding. And I don't know how we're meant to build anything new together while the ranch itself is still bleeding money we don't have.
Then we solve those problems the way we've solved everything else, Diego said. Together, one at a time, without pretending they don't exist. It was not a grand solution, only a steady one. And Elena found she trusted steady far more than grand these days. The following days brought their own quiet difficulties, exactly as Elena had feared. The barn repairs costing more than the ranch's thin savings could comfortably absorb, forcing Elena to sell 2 of her finest breeding cows simply to cover the cost. A decision that pained her deeply, but which she made without complaint, understanding it as the price of moving forward rather than standing still. Mateo remained skeptical for nearly a week, watching Diego with a wary eye whenever he visited, until an afternoon when he found Diego up on the damaged barn roof in the punishing midday heat, working steadily and without complaint. Lucia napping safely in the shade below under Elena's watchful eye. And something in the sight of it, the plain, unglamorous devotion of the work itself, began to soften Mateo's doubts more than any words could have. "You're not what I expected," Mateo admitted to Diego that evening, the 2 men sharing a cup of coffee on the porch while Elena put Lucia down for the night inside. "I came ready to run you off this land, if I'm honest. But I've watched you work all week, and I've watched the way my sister looks at you when she thinks no one's paying attention. And I suppose I owe you an apology for judging too quickly." "None needed," Diego said. "A good brother is supposed to be cautious. I'd want the same for my own daughter when she's grown." It was on a quiet Sunday evening 2 weeks later, the barn roof finally repaired, the calves recovered fully from their illness, that Diego and Elena sat together on the porch step where Rafael used to whistle his 3 familiar notes, watching the sun sink gold and slow over the western hills. Lucia sat between them on a blanket, babbling happily at nothing in particular, and Diego reached into his pocket and drew out, not Marisol's tarnished hairpin this time, but a small ring, simple silver, bought quietly in town the week before with wages he had been saving without telling Elena why. "I know this isn't the grand proposal some might expect," Diego said, turning the ring slowly in his fingers. "I don't have much to offer beyond what I've already given, my hands and my heart, and whatever years are left in me. But I'd like to offer them properly, Elena, if you'll have them." Elena took the ring from him with hands that trembled slightly, though this time not from fear. "I don't need grand," she said softly. "I had grand once, in its own quiet way, with Raphael, and I loved every plain, ordinary day of it. I think what I want now is exactly this. Someone steady beside me on this same step for as many evenings as we're given." She slid the ring onto her finger and looked up at him with eyes bright with unshed tears. "Yes, Diego. My answer is yes." They were married the following month in the small church in town, a simple ceremony attended by Mateo, by Dr. Fuentes, by the handful of ranch hands and neighbors who had watched the whole strange, quiet courtship unfold over the preceding months. Lucia, dressed in a small white gown Elena had sewn herself from an old christening dress found in her grandmother's trunk, the same trunk that had once held the letters that saved the ranch. The seasons turned gently after that, as seasons do, indifferent to human joy or sorrow alike, and a year passed, much the way a good year on a ranch always passes, marked by calving season and branding season, and the long, patient work of building something lasting out of what had once been only survival. Lucia grew steady on her feet, taking her first unsteady steps across the very yard where her father had once arrived, exhausted and desperate, calling out for milk and mercy from a stranger who would become, in time, far more than either of them had dared to hope for that first dusty afternoon. Hector Salinas, for his part, kept largely to his own land after the ruling, the old family shame he had tried so hard to erase, settling instead into a quieter, more private reckoning that was,
in its own way, its own kind of consequence. And though he and Elena never became friends, the fence line between their properties remained undisturbed, the creek running exactly where it always had.
Indifferent to old grudges, the way water is always indifferent to the quarrels of the land it passes through. On the anniversary of the day Diego first walked through the gate, Elena stood on the porch, watching him teach Lucia, now walking steadily and chattering constantly in a happy mix of English and Spanish, how to scatter feed for the chickens, and felt a peace settle over her that she had not believed possible in the long, grief-heavy months after Raphael's death. The ranch had not become easier, exactly. The work of it was still hard, the seasons still uncertain, the ledgers still requiring careful, patient attention. But it had become, at last, a place built not around one person's solitary endurance, but around two people's shared, steady devotion. And a small girl's laughter, ringing bright and constant across land that had finally, fully, become home for all three of them.